Brian, I think a great starting point when we're talking about storylines is obviously the coaching, because we know every single year there is going to be some sort, especially at a place like Notre Dame that has the track record and the prestige that it has. They are going to have coaches that are going to be very attractive in a lot of different instances. So there's been a couple changes in the coaching staff defensively. Of course, Chris O'Leary left to take a assistant coach position with the Los Angeles Chargers, which means you had to find a answer at safeties. And the answer that Notre Dame found was Mike Mickens, who is one of the better cornerback coaches in all of college football, is now the full-time secondary coach. So he'll be handling both the corners and the safeties. And obviously that meant that there was one coaching spot open of a full-time position. They gave that to Max Bulla, who did a tremendous job as a GA last season, right? But everyone knows that he had full handling of the linebacker position and really worked with those guys and had great progressions from 2022 to 2023. So a little bit of a shakeup. Mike Mickens now coaching safeties along with cornerbacks. Max Bulla, the full-time linebacker coach. I guess the first start point is that technically you had retention on the defensive side of the ball. Very familiar names to us, but we do have some guys in a couple new capacities.
Yeah.
So the first storyline is seeing how it all flows together with Al Golden returning for his third year as a defensive coordinator at Notre Dame.
And how does the new look impact Al Golden, right? Like, does he still spend as much time with the linebackers as he did last year? Because, again, that's the position he coached for a long time. Does he spend more time with the safety position? Because, like, we've seen, obviously Clark, the last three defensive coordinators Notre Dame has had were linebacker guys. Al Golden's linebackers coach, Marcus Freeman, and Clark Lee. Guy before that, Mike Elko, is a safeties coach.
Safeties coach, yeah.
Right? Yep. So we've seen that before. And that's something I'm curious to see, Ryan, or does he float? Like, is there certain parts of the team, like as we get into the fall, or are there certain parts of the team that each week I got to spend more time here because of the nature of the game plan? What does it look like in the spring, which is more applicable to what we're talking about now? Does he stay with the linebackers early on to kind of help Max Bulla get his feet wet? Or was that what last year was about? Right? Like, did you do enough with Max Bulla last year to kind of get his feet wet and get him going? Mm-hmm. And so to me, that's a big question. Does he float more? Does he spend the spring, maybe with the new GA, if there's a new safeties GA, working with that guy at the safety position to make sure Mike Mickens can play more corner? Because the unique challenge for Mike Mickens is you're not only having to replace, because Mike Mickens is in charge of 5 positions. There's only 2 starters coming back at those 5 positions now. Corner, field corner, boundary corner, nickel, field safety, boundary safety. There's only 2. Now, the good news for Mike Mickens is those 2 are really, really good. Yep, it's 2 All-Americans, right?
Yeah. Yep.
And then there's a lot of talent coming back at the boundary or at the field corner. And your anticipated new nickel is a 6th-year senior whose dad played defensive back in the National Football League, right?
Who was very productive for Arizona State the last couple of years.
Right. And he's going to bring a high football IQ to the table. He is. So that helps. But outside of that, there's a lot of youth. And that safety challenge is going to be very interesting. And that's probably the thing from a coaching standpoint I'm most curious about is how is the time distributed at safety for Mike Mickens and Al Golden? That's going to be something like, are there going to be times when Al Golden has the safeties, Mike Mickens has the safeties? Because that matters, Ryan, because when you're going through individual periods, Mike Mickens can't have the corners and the safeties together because they're not going to get enough reps. There's going to be a time where he's going to have to make a decision. I'm either with the corners or I'm with the safeties.
And he's only got 2 eyes, so it's impossible to be able to critique everyone's technique and to make sure that they're doing functionally what they should be doing as a individual, right? So it's that was the first thing when the change happened where Max Bulla came on as the full-time linebacker coach was my thought of, I really hope that this gives Al Golden a chance to float a lot more, because although we know that Max Bulla had great responsibility with the linebackers in 2023, it is a situation though where since Al Golden at the time was the linebacker coach, right? There's still an obligation to be there a lot, right? To be able to be there and to have your roots. Now that he is the just full-time defensive coordinator, I think that does free him up. Like, I don't think there's any in the back of his mind an obligation of like, I need to spend a lot of time with the linebackers, because now you aren't the linebacker coach anymore. You are the defensive coordinator. you have a hand in every single thing, and you don't have that linebacker coach title on you anymore. And I hope that he takes advantage of that, man, because functionally, Al Golden's defense is one that you really need to work together well. Like there's some defenses that's just like about, you know, unorganized chaos. Like think of like an Alex Grinch defense, for instance, right? Like
Brent
just
Venables,
throwing it out there,
right?
right? But you could still guess wrong sometimes and still make a play. Al Golden's, it is functioning off of one another really well. So I hope that he takes advantage of that, man. I really do, because that is a great opportunity to really develop a deeper relationship and a deeper trust from all three levels.
Right.
That I think that could be the next step, hopefully, for this defense.
And the thing he's going to have to decide is, where is most of my time going to be spent? Because in
Right.
this defense,
Allocate.
safety and linebacker play are incredibly important to this
Yes.
defense being successful.
Yep.
And you've got a lot of youth at both spots.
Yep.
You could argue that the most physically gifted players at linebacker are your sophomores.
I
You
would
know,
argue that probably.
right?
I would argue that. Yeah.
At safety, your most gifted players, your fifth-year senior All-American. But after
Right.
that, there's some talent there, but very
Yep.
different type of talent. Don
Yes.
Schuler, Luke Talich, Ben Minnick, three completely different players from each other, right?
Different
All
body
young.
types, different
So yeah,
styles.
there's a lot of coaching that needs to be done there.
Yep.
So it's going to be fascinating. I've never cared as much about who a GA was going to be at Notre Dame than I do right now, figuring out who the defensive GAs are going to be and who's going
Yep.
to be working with the DBs and how are they going to utilize that. So, because I can make a case that Al Gold needs to spend the first several practices with the defense, making sure that, with the linebackers. Of course, he's with the defense. Duh. He's the defensive coordinator. The linebackers, because of the integral part of, from a communication standpoint, of getting everyone lined up that the linebackers play. And it won't be so much about, I'm still the linebackers coach, but it's more about, that's the foundation needs to be laid. I could also see him saying the same exact thing, but this is why I need to be at safety, because that's also a very important communicative position, right? If the linebackers are getting everybody lined up, but the safeties aren't, problems, big problems. And with Xavier Watson, especially, and that's where DJ Brown played such an important role on this defense last year, is his ability to communicate to Xavier, to the corners, to the linebackers, what was going on. And so how do you replace that? And what role does Al Golden play in getting that going, Ryan? Because that's going to kind of answer what I think that's going to play a big role in kind of what the second storyline is what will this defense be? Will it be the same but different? Meaning this defense is not going to repeat the production of last year in the exact same form, meaning they're not going to match the same number of sacks, tackles for lost breakups. It can be just as dominant, but differently. Maybe this defense gives up maybe a few more big plays, but they have a lot more negatives, right? Meaning tackles for loss and sacks. Well, okay, you gave up more big plays, but your yardage was about the same because you created more -3s and -4s and -5s, right? Like, so that's why I say is the end game could be the same, but how you get there is very different. Or will it take a step back? Or, and what would that mean? That means your just ability to consistently make the stops is hurt by the fact that in the way Al Golden calls the game, and we learned this in 2022, it takes one guy to not do his job for a third night against Marshall to get turned into a 20-yard gain and a first down to set up the game-winning touchdown drive. One guy.
Absolutely.
And so that goes back to what we talked about earlier, which is what made it so good was the fact that they all play together. Will we see more of that one young guy at safety or linebacker or whatever making those mistakes that turns that big play loose? That's where the step back comes. Or could it take a step forward? And I think if it's going to take a step forward, Ryan, I think we will see that this spring, because I think we will see a lot more of the playmaking, but not accompanied with just the offense ripping off a bunch of big plays. I don't know that I'll be able to say definitively, yep, they're going to be better, but I think we'll get a glimpse like, hey, I think they got a chance to be better by what we see this spring. And what that would look like, Ryan, is you are still limiting the big plays. You're still clutch in the red zone. You're, like they were the worst red zone defense in the country in 2022. They were in the top 3 in 2023. Are they going to go back to one of those? Do they meet in the middle? Like, those are all things determined by how well you handle those little things. But we could see this group be better by still handling those little things, but because you're such a more athletic group, that now you're also making more big plays. Why are we better on third down this year? Is it because the guys are more, looking at it from a defensive coordinator standpoint, are we better on third down this year because my scheme was better? Are we better on third down this year because we can lock people down better? Or are we better on third down this year because we were so good at creating disruptives on first and second down that we were getting teams into more 3rd and 9s and 3rd and 10s and 3rd and 11s? That's how you get better. That's why disruptives are so important. And if there's one area on this team, Ryan, that has to get the most, that we need to see the most improvement from, and it's something that impacts the entire defense, it's that right there. This defense has to get a lot better at creating negatives up front in the run game. That impacts your pass rush, that impacts your breakups, that impacts your run game. That's the area that is going to be important. And that, to me, is why I have a little bit of an excitement. Oh, gosh, this could be good. Because you are going to have guys like Josh Burnham and hopefully a breakout from Jordan Patejo. But that's where the Drake Bowens and the Jalen Sneeds and the Jaden Osburys and the Kingston William-Asas start to kind of get you excited, because those blitzes that you were seeing last year are going to hit home just a little bit quicker with some of these guys if they mentally can figure it out. That's the key, and that's how it gets better. And I think if we're talking about breakouts this spring being Drake Bowen and Jaden Osbury or Kingston or guys like that, that's when you start saying, like, hey, this defense has got a chance to be really, really special. Because those linebackers, they made some mistakes, man, but they made a lot of plays. That's what's going to tell me by the end of spring, hey, this has got a chance to be an even better defense than it was a year ago.
Well, I would say it like this too. By the way, if you're just joining us or you just joined us the last couple minutes, we're not doing a mailbag today. If you have a super chat question that you want to ask, though, throw the super chat in. We will make sure to answer it during this podcast. Just a quick reminder there. I would say this too, Brian. Like, look, we're all going to hyper focus over the players' perspective, right? Of who's playing where and how quickly are they adapting to the system and how do they look on a day-to-day perspective. I would also say, though, to that conversation, this is a big opportunity for Al Golden, once again, to learn his players a little bit deeper. Because if we're talking about the linebacker specifically, you're 100% correct that it's going to look different. And if Al Golden is as good of a defensive coordinator as I think he is, and I think most of us think he is, then he is going to be able to look at his players this spring, learn them a little deeper, and understand, hey, I'm not going to ask Drake Bowen to do the same things that I asked JD Bertrand to do, but that might actually be beneficial for my defense long-term, potentially. But ultimately, if he is a great defensive coordinator, he is going to learn what they do well, and we're going to start to see it in the spring of guys getting more comfortable because they're going to be asked to do what they are good at and be able to ask to do what they're comfortable with early on as you continue to expand and to put more on their plates. I really hope that when we leave the spring, because you mentioned, I hope that a couple of more breakouts, but I think more than anything, you just see a little bit of tea leaves of understanding of like, oh, that's how Al Golden's going to use Drake Bowen this year. Oh, that's how he could potentially use Jaden Osbury in his system. That's how he could use Jalen Sneed, Jack Kaiser, like these types of guys that are coming back, but more specifically outside of Jack Kaiser, the younger guys, being able to learn his players and be able to implement them uniquely. Because I think that's the evolution as a defensive coordinator is so undersold, because we just think about this is the system, the players fit in, you shut up and you go do your job. But it's not as simple as that, man, because every team is so unique. And the defense this year is going to be much different than what it was in 2023, just from a personnel perspective. So if Al Golden is worth anything, this is going to be an opportunity over the next few weeks to learn his players a little bit deeper and to start evolving his understanding of this is how it's going to fit into my defense. This is how I'm going to uniquely utilize this player to make sure that he fits to my scheme, but to adapt and to evolve a little bit as well.
Ryan, I'm going to tie something in here. One of the storylines that we're going to talk about, that we've talked a lot about already, that will be a storyline this spring, is linebacker play. How good will they be? Here's a really interesting way to look at it. They've proposed a new rule in college football about putting mics in the helmets of at least one player on offense and defense. That rule has not been passed yet, which means you're not going to be doing it during the spring, which I think is great, because it takes away the crutch of having that with your young Mike linebacker. However, I think the timing of this is great for Notre Dame because in the spring, you force Drake, you force Kingston, you force Jaden Ausberry, 3 guys that I can all see playing Mike in this defense. They have to learn, they have to communicate. They don't have that aid. However, by the time you get to the fall and that rule gets passed, one thing that you're going to be able to do to help kind of alleviate the loss of JD Bertrand, who anyone around the program will tell you that guy knew the defenses like outside of the coaches. I mean, as well as anybody, he could literally get he was like having a coach on the field. Well, now you're going to have a coach in Drake's ear. That's something that could help. It's not going to completely bridge the gap, Ryan, but it helps because you can kind of up to a certain point tell him, hey, make this check, make this check, make this check, especially against teams that are going fast. That's where it'll help you the most is because you can be in his ear with the checks and the calls up until, whatever the rule is about when it turns off. So that's going to be something fascinating as well, Ryan, that I'm so glad that rule has only been proposed right now. I expect it to pass, but if it does, it'll be in the fall after these young linebackers have had to go a full spring of having to learn the signals, having to think for themselves, having to make checks on their own, and having the mistakes of not making the right checks during the spring. I think it's something that could really benefit them come fall that they had to go through that. But then you get that little assist of having the mic in your ear once you get into the fall. I think that's going to be an important part too that I think helps with this process.
Well, we were gonna talk about linebackers in like a couple bullet points for now, but I think that's a perfect transition to the linebacker position because we wanted to originally go from defensive line back to the secondary and talk about the individual storylines on each level. But I think as we're talking about linebackers so much here, I think it's a perfect blend into will the linebackers be a strength or will they be a weakness a little bit this year, right? And I think that we're going to get again after the spring. You are going to have months until the fall camp to be able to figure out and to be able to fix things, to be able to work on things. And, there's going to be opportunities obviously to watch more film and to dig deeper into the defense, to develop a deeper understanding. But ultimately, I think that we are going to get a glimpse in the spring. We are, right? There is a reality where we come out of the spring either feeling like a lot of work to do there, or wow, that unit might be better than I thought it was going to be with the youth that it has. So will the deep linebackers be a strength in 2024? I think we're going to start to get a glimpse in the next few weeks here.
Well, and it also, along those same lines, Ryan, gives us a glimpse of how good is Marcus Freeman as an evaluator at that position, because the linebacking core outside of Jack Kaiser is entirely built by his evaluations with Jalen Sneed and Drake Bowen and a lot of those guys. So that's going to be a big part. He was the driving factor in all those guys committing. Drake Bowen committed to Notre Dame when Marcus Freeman was still the defensive coordinator. Jaden Ausberry's primary recruiter, his entire process was Marcus Freeman. Preston Zinner committed to Notre Dame when Marcus Freeman was still the linebackers coach. So you look at it and say, if he's the evaluator we think he is, then the talent's going to shine. It'll be there because, to me, if you're a good coach, talent always rises to the top. The question is your coaching methods, does it require a full year in the system to get there like it did in 22 and 23, or does it allow you to say, hey, we can adapt now that everybody knows the defense, we can adapt? Because the difference between going into this year with new starters and compared to 2022 is because in 2022, it was new for everybody. It didn't matter if you were a fifth-year senior or a true freshman. You were hearing this stuff for the first time in a lot of instances. Now, even though Drake Bowen's going to his first year as a starter potentially, or Jaden Ausberry might be potentially going to his first year as a starter or whatever the case may be, they've been in the system for a year. Right. So it's not like this is brand new, but so it's not so much that Al Golden's got to go back to square one and fix the mistakes of 2022. It's a kind of a meet me in the middle type of situation. How effectively can he do that? Because if Marcus Freeman's the evaluator that we think he is, and if Al Golden's the defensive coordinator that we think he is, you're going to see the linebacking core have some really good moments and a couple rough moments against Texas A&M. Right. But they're now going to have 4 games under their belts before that thing heats up again, that they can learn from some of those mistakes. But the spring period is going to be so crucial because they have to go from here to here by the end of spring. And then, from the end of spring to fall, it's just a little bit of a jump. But the big jumps are going to happen. The first chance you have at just those live reps, not 7-on-7, with your teammates, but those live team reps, those live 7-on-7s with coaches, that's when you're going to see the chance at the big jump. And if they don't make that big jump, even with a lot of mistakes, it's going to make me a little bit nervous. But if we see the big jump, we're like, hey, there's a lot of stuff to clean up. But man, when these guys are on, they're pretty flipping good. That's when but if the end of spring, we're like, I don't know if this guy's as good as we thought he was. That's when I'll start to get a little bit nervous, Ryan, because now we're talking about the talent jump isn't as great as we think it's going to be, and it's less experienced. That's where you have a question. And right now, we're still feeling good about our evaluations of Drake Bowen and Jaden Osprey and those guys.
Sure.
But this is the first time we're really going to see that get put to the test.
Yeah.
And that's something that we're going to learn about this group too. So I think that's why we've spent so much time on the linebacking core, Ryan, because you can't hide that group. No. You can hide the safeties a little bit, Ryan. I mean, in certain schemes, you can hide them a little bit. You can't hide linebackers in this, not in this kind of defense.
No,
you just can't.
You certainly cannot. You certainly cannot. There's a lot on those guys' plates, both from just getting things set up, consistent run fits. Obviously, they're asked to blitz a lot and from various spots as well. I mean, it's not an easy position to play in that defense, to be honest. And I think that a key thing is that not all production is created equal. I mean, there's a possibility that the linebackers are equally or more productive on box score in 2024, but it's not consistent as far as the play from a snap to snap perspective. Like,
Ryan, I'd be willing to bet you that it'll be more productive. I'd be willing to bet you a steak dinner it will be more productive.
Yeah.
But I think but your point, finish your point, because it's important. Because as you said, numbers don't always tell you the story, Ryan, as far as are you playing championship football? That's the key.
Right. Well, I mean, I think if if you go on PFF, for instance, right, and you're looking at some of the data collection stuff, like let's say I'm just going to use Drake as an example because we talked a lot about Drake Bowen so far, but Drake has a game where he has 9 total tackles, a sack. Just the raw data there would be like, oh, that's a pretty dang good football game, right? But there were 2 missed assignments in there. There were 2 missed tackles in there. One of those missed tackles led to a 30-yard gain for the team to ice the game and to win the victory. Like raw numbers do not often tell the story. It's about the consistency from a snap to snap perspective. I mean, there have been some linebackers in the NFL over the last few years where it's just like they make 1 million tackles, but the box score doesn't tell you that they also missed 20 more, right? And that most of their tackles were 6 to 7 yards downfield instead of 0 to 3, where you want to kind of be, right? So those things are all hidden in a box score at times. That's why we always defer to the film. Like the data collection stuff's cool, the box scores is cool, but ultimately, what are you doing on a snap to snap perspective from when the eye in the sky? Because that thing doesn't lie typically. So, yeah, that is ultimately what I'm looking for the linebackers. Luckily, we talked about this in front of them. A lot of experience coming back on the defensive line. The front 4, including the 2 interior defensive linemen, nose tackle 3 technique. We have the boundary defensive end position, which is your old Viper that we've been talking about for years. And then the field end is obviously the big end position. That's going to involve a little bit more of a bigger body and physicality. There's a lot of production coming back from a college perspective. The interior defensive line, we've talked about it. Howard Cross coming off of a All-American level season. He made All-American this past year by 2 different publications, or was it just 1? I can't remember exactly, but
it was like 3 or 4.
3?
Yeah, I mean,
okay,
it was several. Yeah, it was several.
Yeah. So
he was never higher than second, but yeah, I think he made like I'll look it up while you're talking, right? Because now it's going to bother me. But I thought it was like 3 or 4.
Oh, no, he was tremendous this past year. I mean, a high tackle number, and there were some games like we all talk about the Duke game as far as like that game was just bananas for a defensive lineman. But you have Howard Cross coming back as your nose. You have Riley Mills coming back for now year 2 of him being a full-time interior player after playing a lot of big end early in his career. So you got your 2 stalwarts inside. And although he hasn't played in a Notre Dame uniform yet, RJ Oben being there has played a lot of football over the last couple of years. That's experience. You got Jordan Botelho coming back, and we need to see him obviously take a step forward from a production perspective, but he's played a lot of football. I mean, you have guys that have played a lot of football. It's going to be about seeing where RJ fits, just what type of player he could be, and to start to assimilate that role. And then obviously we need to see the Viper position, the boundary end position really take a step forward. So great baseline to build off of, but just how much more impactful could it be going into 2024? Hopefully we get to see that a little bit this spring.
It was 4.
4?
Ryan. So yeah,
Nice.
it was, and
That's great.
it was the big ones. It was Sporting News, Associated Press, Walter Camp, and Football Writer. So 4 of the 5 that determine unanimous and consensus All American. So it wasn't like PFF or some other like CBS Sports. I mean,
Pro
not that
Football
there's anything
Network.
wrong with. I mean,
Yeah.
those are great honors as well. But it's just there's a difference to that and then the other ones. And he was also a Bednarik Award semifinalist. And that duo is interesting, Ryan, as you look at and preview the spring, is because Howard, it's just about do what you just did. I mean,
Mhm.
honestly, I don't know how much better Howard Cross can be than he was last year. And
Right. honestly,
I don't need him to be any better.
You need me exactly the
Just
same.
do
Yep.
what you did last year, right? I mean,
Right.
that's going to be the big key. The question up the middle is how good they're going to be is going to be determined, in my opinion, by how good Riley Mills is. Riley
Yep.
Mills is an intriguing player because I think Riley Mills has kind of jumped into this whipping boy kind of place with fans.
Right.
And I'm like, I had this conversation with somebody a couple months ago, and they're like, Howard Cross was so much better than Riley Mills. And I was like, okay, based on what? And he was like, well, look at the numbers. I'm like, okay, let's look at the numbers. They were almost identical, from a production standpoint in disruptive numbers. Obviously, Howard was better at tackles, but when it came to like tackles for loss and other numbers, very similar. Howard Cross is a 7, Riley Mills is a 5.5. Well, when you
Right.
consider that Howard Cross played 610 snaps last year and Riley Mills played 535, that's pretty close production in those areas. Riley had more sacks than Howard did last season. Riley had 2.5 sacks last year. Howard had 2. And Howard Cross rushed the quarterback last year 341 times. Riley Mills did it 258 times. Howard Cross led the team in total pass and pressures, according to Pro Football Focus. He had 39 on 341 pass rushes. Riley Mills was at 32 on 258 pass rushes. Howard Cross had 8 sacks plus hits on the quarterback. Riley Mills had 12. Howard Cross had 33 run stops. Riley Mills had 27. So Riley Mills was a good football player last year. The reason I think he's kind of jumped into that whipping boy place, which I think is completely unfair, because if Riley Mills just repeats what he did last year, that's one of the best D-tackle combos in all of college football again.
Right.
But the reason is because when you look at Riley and you look at Howard, you expect this guy to be way better than that guy. That's what it boils down to for me. And that's fair. I mean, Howard's barely 6 feet tall, 280 pounds. Riley's a 6'5", 300-pound long arm behemoth, and he's a pretty good athlete. And so I understand where it's coming from. But what I would encourage fans to do is say, hey, listen, just gauge him on what he does, not what your expectations are. Number one. Number two, however, it's really hard to do that, Ryan, because when you think about when Riley was at his best last year, he could take over games. Go watch the USC game. And that's the thing is, can Riley do that on a more consistent basis? Because that's the thing about Howard. Howard brought it every week.
Yes.
There was never a time that I didn't think Riley was playing hard, but there was a lot of times I didn't think he was playing as well as he can.
Right.
If he can be a more consistent player like Howard was, then he becomes a more dominant player. And now all of a sudden, Howard Cross is your second best D tackle. And if that's the case, and Howard still repeats what he did last year, that's how you become a truly elite defense. And that, Ryan, let's go back to linebackers. That's going to have a huge impact on the linebackers, because now Drake Bowen or Jaden Alsbury or Kingston, they're not getting touched. They're not getting touched the entire game, and that's a big difference. You want to talk about the play of the linebackers? One of the biggest differences between this year and last year, J.D. Bertrand and Maris Lewifau aren't great at block destruction for different reasons. J.D. because he's got 30-inch arms, and Maris because his technique is still not very good. But they never really had to do it this year with the kind of frequency they did a year ago, because the offensive line had to stay on that first level trying to handle Riley Mills and Howard Cross. If Riley can raise his game even higher, which he's capable of, that's going to be huge for the linebackers, Ryan. And not just him, but I also expect the group behind them to be even better, because now Jason Onye's got a year under his belt. Donovan Heinisch has a year under his belt. And then that sophomore class, that rising sophomore class of Brendan Vernon, who's going to move inside, Devin Houston, and Armel Mukum. If at least one of those three can kind of force his way into the rotation, that's where I start to get really excited about what this interior group can be, Ryan.
Yeah. I would say it like this. I think that people adore, from a fan perspective, I think people adore Howard Cross because he has gotten the most out of his talent. I
Mhm.
mean, I don't think we expect a big jump because I just don't know if there's much room to go up after that, what he just did in 2023. I mean, consistency, being that again would be great, but ultimately you saw Howard Cross get just about as much out of his talent as you could possibly ask for. Riley Mills is the complete opposite in the sense of Riley has been a good player, but there is still a lot of upside there, man. Like he has not hit his ceiling. He has not. And I think that's why people are just urging, like, give me the best version of yourself every single week. Because if you do, then you're going to be a great football team, especially on the interior. There's no doubt
Yeah.
about that. So we'll see that take a next step. I think you hit a great point. And I mean, we're getting to the point where the interior defensive line is starting to look the way that you need it to look in order to be a championship level team,
Yeah.
just physically, right? Because now, and someone said in the chat, that Riley used to be like a unicorn. Like you'd be like, oh my god, look at that guy inside. Now it's like there's 4 of them now where
Right.
they look like
Right.
that, right? Like they all look like that. And that's where you need to get to. I mean, I always talk about with the Georgia team, but it's like people hyper focused over Jordan Davis and Devontae Wyatt a couple years ago. But I kept talking about but guys, when they take them off the field, Jalen Carter's coming in and Nazir Stackhouse is coming in and Warren Brinson's coming in. And all these freak shows are just coming in. And that's where you need to get to, right? Especially at Notre Dame, where you are going to make your money by being physically imposing and being dominant in the trenches. You need to have that interior defensive line to be able to restock. And you're 100% like you saw the flashes with Jason Onye last year. You saw it.
Mhm.
It's there. It's there. Armel Mukum, if you followed this channel for recruiting stuff, like Armel Mukum has about as much physical gifts as anybody in that room. When you talk about physical gifts, Devin Houston also has a ton of them. Brendan Vernon fitting inside. That was once a very highly thought of defensive lineman that has now his body's continuing to grow and to be able to play inside. Like all those guys have the talent to be substantial at Notre Dame. Which one takes a jump? Does any of them take a jump? Do multiple of them take a jump? That's the question mark for this offseason that I'm excited to start to see in the spring, as is the Viper position, as we finish up our defensive line talk, because I really think that is the unlocking ability of being a elite group in 2024 for Notre Dame, because you expect the interior defensive line to be very good. I expect with RJ Oben for the big end position to be at least a good unit, if not a very good unit, potentially, at least from a pass rush perspective. The Viper position is one where there's certainly talent, but who takes
Yeah.
advantage? Is this Jordan Patelho breakout season? Is Boubacar Traore start to gain traction? Is it some of the young guys? Like, who is the guys that are going to be substantial producers
Does
here?
regular season Patelho start to look like
Yeah.
bowl season Patelho, right? Like
Oh,
that.
man.
That's the
Yeah,
other question.
seriously.
That's the
Seriously.
interesting thing, Ryan, because this is what the crazy thing. The defensive line to me fueled a lot of the success from last season. And I don't think the D line even got as much credit as it should have because I don't think people appreciated how good the D tackle combo was, right? Like even after we said all that, somebody said Howard Cross is a dog, Mills is overrated. So the guy who had better per snap production is overrated than the guy that everybody loves because he's 6 foot 280 pounds and like you said gets the most out of it. As a duo, whatever your feelings are, as a duo, they were excellent last year. Excellent. And so, but on the edge, even though they can get better, if they just repeat what they did last year, Notre Dame's pretty good. Like really, really good at that spot. But the ends can't repeat what they did last year. Like you need RJ Oben to be a more all-around player than he was last year. You need Duke, because and that's not a knock on RJ Oben. That's just not how they used him. They played him on a really wide technique. They'd fit inside of him with their linebackers and safeties. So he was kind of a force player against the run, not a real impact guy the way that they used. I mean, there were a lot of times last year where Javonte Jean-Baptiste was shooting inside and against the run. He was a force against the run. They didn't use RJ Oben that way. So he's going to have to learn to be better in that regard. Josh Burnham needs to take a year 3 jump, right? You need Jordan Patelho to take a huge jump last year. You need Junior Tuilamaka to take a huge jump next year. You need Boubacar Traore to go on. They can't repeat what they did last year, Ryan. Jordan Patelho And Junior Tuihalamaka last season, if you look at the Pro Football Focus numbers, had a combined 18 total pressures last season. All of them came from Jordan Botelho. Junior Tuihalamaka did not have a single tackle for loss last season, a single pressure last season, according to Pro Football Focus. Like they're just, I'm sorry, they had 22 pressures. 18 of them came from Junior. They had 4.5 tackles for loss and 4 sacks. Those all came from Jordan Botelho. Excuse me, I said that incorrectly. You can't have Junior Tuihalamaka playing the number of snaps that he played last season, which was over 100. He played 166 snaps last year. You can't have him doing that and not producing a single tackle for loss at Viper, a single sack, only 4 total hurries on the season, and none of his pressures resulted in a hit on the quarterback. He had 0 hits or sacks on the quarterback. Can't have that. I mean, Ryan, Boubacar Traore last season played what? Like
3 snaps or
10
something?
snaps, something like that. Like, where was Boubacar? I mean, Boubacar had
it was low, man. It was not much.
Played 27 snaps last season.
Oh, really?
Well, a lot of it came in the bowl game.
Gotcha.
He played 10 in the bowl game. He had 17 in the regular season. Never played more than 6 in the regular season. He was able to manage a sack, right? I mean, so that's the thing is you cannot have all of those guys repeat their production. That's going to be the big question. And here's the storyline, Ryan, is you've got this great experience up the middle and production and talent, right? Veteran talent, young talent, lots of talent. How good will the storyline of D tackle is how good are they going to be?
Right.
The storyline of D end is are they going to be good?
Right.
Right. And we don't know you and I think RJ Oben's going to be a really, really good pickup.
I do, yeah.
But we need to see it because they didn't use him at Duke the way they're going to use him at Notre Dame. I think you and I believe Josh Burnham has got a chance to be a breakout player for Notre Dame this year.
It's possible.
You and I think Jordan Botelho can be better than what he showed last year.
Sure.
I think Junior can be better than what he showed last year, although I've never been super high on Junior as an edge player. I'm just never having that.
I still don't get that. I still don't understand that one,
I know you and I think Boubacar can be a dude, and then Bryce Young's an early enrollee. We haven't mentioned him yet. So there's so much potential there, but so many great questions. And that group, to me, the light going on for they don't all need to be like if the light doesn't go on for Junior and Botelho, but it goes on for Boubacar, okay, fine. And if it goes on for Boubacar and Bryce Young, fine, because what you can do is you can have Bryce Young be the number 2 behind RJ Oben. You can move Josh Burnham back to Viper, and Boubacar and Burnham are taking over Viper. Or you could move RJ Oben to Viper, and then Burnham and Bryce Young can play the big end with Aiden Gobira and Tyson Ford and guys like that, right? Like, so the thing that encourages me is there's so much talent there that I don't think you have to rely on Jordan Botelho as much as you did last year if he doesn't play well. I think you're going to have guys there say, you know what, dude, if you're not going to get the job done, we got somebody else who can get the job done. And I'm hoping that is something that pushes Burnham or Botelho this offseason. Because if he can just think about this, he had 18 pressures last year, all of last year, played 12 games, I believe. I think he missed a game last season. Let me look that up just to be sure. I could be wrong on that. Jordan Botelho last season, thought he missed. Just give me a second, Ryan. I'm gonna find this one. You know how I am, man. I get that in my head now. He played 13. Oh, I was wrong. He played all 13 games last year. Had 18 total pressures. Randy had 10 in the Gator Bowl the year before. 10 in one game the year before. And so you look at it and you're like, how the heck does that happen?
Right.
Like when you look at his 2022 production, he almost matched his entire production in 2023 in 2 games in 2022. Because remember, he went off against Syracuse in the second half as well, had 4 total pressures, 3 hits on the quarterback.
Yeah.
And then 10 in the bowl game with 2 sacks and a hit on the quarterback. So in 2 games, he had 4 sacks and 2 hits on the quarterback. This past year, he had 3 and 4 for the whole season. So it's like, who is he? If he can just be in between those 2 guys, he's going to be a pretty solid player. And now it's about developing what's behind him. But if we see a repeat of what we saw last year, this defensive line is just not going to be as good as it needs to be. And I don't think you can get away with that this year like you could last year, because you did have such experience at safety and you did
Mhm.
have the experience at linebacker that they could overcome those mistakes. You have him playing like that this year, plus you're going to have the higher level of technical and assignment mistakes at linebacker. It's just going to happen. It just accept
Right.
it, prepare for it. It
Yep.
creates even bigger issues.
Mhm.
And that's the concern. And so, Ryan, the reason depth is important because depth creates a smaller margin for error. Whereas a couple years ago, it was like you had to move Myron Tungvaloa to big end, and Alexander Ahrensberger is one of your rotation guys. Now you're talking about, okay, are they going to find does Aiden Go Byron Tyson Ford have a chance to play this year? Like, think about that, right? Is Bryce Young going to have a chance to play this year? Like you're talking about your defensive end position depth chart being RJ Oben, Josh Burnham, Bryce Young, Tyson Ford, Aiden Go Byron. Those are all 5 dudes, like
Yep.
talent wise. And you're like, so that's why I'm like, that's why I'm so confident that at the big end position, that defensive end position, they're going to be fine, because of that 5, I think 3 of them are going to be ready to play in some capacity. I don't have the same confidence at Viper because it's
Sure.
basically Betelho, it's Junior Tuilamaka, it's Boubacar Traore, it's Logan Thomas, who's 195 pounds, and Cole Mullins, who's coming off of a broken leg. Like, that's why it's Betelho stepping up is so important for this team
Yep.
this offseason. It is.
He's an enigma. He's an
Yeah.
enigma. I think that Viper position is a little bit of an enigma, to be honest.
Yeah.
There's a lot of talents there, but a lot of just inconsistency and unproven play in a lot of instances. So we'll
Right.
see how the defensive line begins to mesh and move forward here. Let's talk about the secondary, and then we'll kind of get into the position battles next here on the podcast. But secondary, Brian, was fantastic in 2023. You had Benjamin Morrison, who, at least as a cover player, was equally as good as the year before, if not a little bit better. Tackling needs to improve, but overall, as a coverage player, was very good. Cam Hart was fantastic throughout the year, put together his best season in 2023. You had Xavier Watts, who led the all of the FBS, at least in interceptions this past year, and was an All-American level player. You lose DJ Brown that we talked about. We're losing Thomas Harper, but you're replacing them potentially with some pretty talented football players. Rob Hurd will not be here in the spring, but Rod Hurd will be here this offseason. But you have Adon Schuler, a couple of nice young safeties there. You brought in Jordan Clark to play nickel. You also have Jaden Mickey, who could potentially play a little bit inside at times. You have Clarence Lewis that could play inside to kind of be like a little bit of a Swiss Army knife as a reserve. So,
And you didn't
on
even mention their fastest player, Micah Bell.
Micah
It's
Bell,
another
too.
guy
Yeah.
that's going to have a shot to jump this year.
You have a lot of talent in the secondary. There is zero question about that. Now, obviously, you're losing a very good player in Cam Hart. You're losing some dependability in Thomas Harper. You're losing a guy that was pretty rock solid in 2022 in DJ Brown. Like, you're losing a couple talented pieces there. But the question is that although Notre Dame was excellent in the secondary in 2023, could this team be better in 2024 on the back end? I think it's possible. It's a tall ask, but it certainly has the talent, it would appear, to do so.
I'm going to tell you my opinion on this, Ryan, and I want to see if you agree or not. Will it be better than it was last year? I don't know. But my expectation that it will be is, like we talked about the linebackers. This is where I'm going with this, Ryan. At linebacker, we said there's a chance it could be better than it was last year. There's a chance that it could be. But I have, and we're saying the same thing about the secondary. I have way more confidence that the secondary is going to be better than it was a year ago than I will linebacker. And part of the reason for that is I think the talent that they're losing at line, like JD Bertrand and DJ Brown, are not the same thing, right? Like DJ Brown was a great leader, great mental guy, did his job, but he had physical limitations athletically. JD's only physical limitations was he wasn't very big and or long, but like athletically, JD can play at a place like Notre Dame. And so to me, losing him is a whole lot different. Plus, it just, there's the physical demands of playing linebacker compared to the secondary. But the other part of it too is some of the guys you're losing, you're almost kind of like, I respect what you did, but I'm kind of ready to see what the next wave can do because there's such a huge difference in athleticism talent. Like I think there's going to be an upgrade in athleticism at linebacker next year, but it won't be as great as what I think it's going to be at safety. When you talk about losing DJ Brown and now you're talking about a Don Schuler and Luke Talich and Ben Mink, they're all much better athletes than DJ Brown was. And they're all much more instinctive football players than Ramon Henderson was, who was a very athletic player but didn't know how to play football. And then at nickel, you basically took one guy and replaced him with the exact same dude for the most part, and then now you've got guys like Michael Bell. So just the overall talent there, Ryan, is so good. And I think it's easier for a young corner in this defense to transition to a starting position than it is for a linebacker, in my view. That's the other part of it too. So I think even though it's a question mark at all three levels, the one position that I'm most confident is going to improve to where it was last year. D-line could be better than it was last year. Linebacker could be better. Secondary, the one group that I'm most confident will be is this one right here at secondary. That's the one I'm most confident is going to make that jump.
Yeah, and you also have reinforcements coming in after the spring. We obviously mentioned Rod Hurd, the transfer from Northwestern.
Ryan, do you think it's best for this group as a whole that Rod Hurd's not here this spring? Because I feel, and I'll say this, because I feel like with Rod Hurd not being here, he misses out on the opportunity to learn the defense and make that transition. Right. However, he's a guy that's played a ton of football. What he did at Northwestern is the way he played nickel at Northwestern is a lot more similar to how they use DJ Brown than how they use Thomas Harper at Notre Dame. Sure. But the reps that the young sophomores and the freshman Kennedy Urlacher, who I don't think is going to be a factor at safety this year. I think where Kennedy Urlacher could make an impact as a freshman is as a special teams cover guy. But as a safety, even though I liked him more than most, I just don't see him being that guy. But the reps that a Don Schuler and Luke Talich and Ben Minnick are going to get without Rod Hurd being here, I think is going to be incredibly beneficial. But number one, but number two, you're going to have a lot more certainty of who they are as a coaching staff coming out of the spring to the point of, okay, now we know what Rod can be. Or, you know what? We need to go to the portal for depth there because these guys weren't ready to handle jobs. So I think it's actually better for the group as a whole for those two reasons to not have Rod Hurd this spring. I really think, because I don't know if you could necessarily get all those answers. If Rod Hurd comes in and he plays great, he adapts quickly, that's great. But what if one of those guys goes down? You don't know what you have behind him. So that's kind of my I know it's an interesting take, but that's kind of my take on that one at safety. But as a whole, I think the talent in the secondary is going to be so much better. There's going to be more speed. There's going to be more pure cover ability. I think you're going to be able to see them play more pure, like just cover one this year than they did a year ago, where they can use Xavier a little bit more in man coverage. And you can use your field corner a little bit more in man coverage. So I think this secondary has a chance to be better, but they got to prove it, Ryan. That's all theory. They got to prove it. There's no doubt about it. They got to prove it.
Yeah, I think the big storyline is going to be the sophomore defensive backs this year when you're talking about secondary play. I mean, everyone's going to want updates on how Christian Gray's looking, how Micah Bell's looking, how Ben Minnick is looking, how Adon Schuler is looking, how Luke Talich is looking. Like, you want to hear about those guys. Like, I think it's very advantageous if you hear a lot about those guys in a positive light this spring. So I hope so, man. I hope that we get to see. The last thing we want to talk about as key storyline here is there were two areas that we kind of hyper focused on as far as, because everything can be improved upon, right? Like, there's nothing that is just perfect. And I think that two parts of the defense for Notre Dame from 2023 that can be improved upon. One, pass rush. They were disruptive last year, but they didn't always finish. So the sack numbers were a little bit down comparative to what they have been in recent years. Sack number were down. And I think the other part of it is your rush defense. Now, the rush defense took a step in 2023 compared to where it was in 2022. Does it get any better? Is it sustainable with the younger linebackers that we talked about a whole lot in this podcast? Like, just what does the run defense look like on top of the pass rush?
Yeah, that's and so many things we talked about are going to factor into that, Ryan. Last year you were really smart. Everybody's in the right position, but you weren't necessarily dynamic in the front seven at big end, Viper, linebacker. You're going to be more dynamic this year, but you're not going to be as assignment correct. How do those two things go together? it's going to be fascinating. I mean, the overall rush defense numbers last year, Ryan, were very good. I mean, they only
Mhm.
give up 119 yards per game on the ground last year, 3.5 yards per carry. That's pretty good. But you've got to use a caveat and say that the bowl game was a bit of an anomaly. You held
Right.
a team to 2 yards that was playing with 4 brand new offensive linemen. And as we pointed out, they're not replacing their departed linemen with Charles Jagasol and Tosh Baker and Billy Shrouth and Ashton Craig. They're replacing them with guys that aren't as good. And so that factors into it. So when you look at the run defense group, I mean, last 3 games of the regular season, they gave up 176, 134, and 143 yards. You know, they also gave up 126 against Navy, which is pretty good. 131 to Central Michigan, 189 to Duke, 185 to Louisville. So there were some spots last year where the run defense just wasn't good enough. Against Clemson, it wasn't good enough. Gave up 176. So that part of the defense is going to have to get a lot better, in my opinion. And if they don't, then it's going to be somewhat limiting on just how good they can be, because they were a great defense last season. But if you want to talk about a defense that can truly take that next step and win in spite of the offense, these 2 areas have to get better. And my examples for that are the way that they lost to Ohio State and the way that they lost to Clemson. There was nothing the defense was going to be able to do against Louisville. The offense just didn't come to play. But they weren't able to against Ohio State. It was, can you make that big stop late in the game? They weren't able to do it. And a big part of that is because they couldn't just dial up a pass rush with 3-4 guys. They kind of needed to blitz last year to really be effective rushing the quarterback. And you're going to need a little bit more of a pure pass rush from that group. And then of course against Clemson, they physically, that was the one game where I felt I just thought Clemson got the better of them in the physical battle. Notre Dame competed, but they weren't sharp. They weren't quite as physical. They got moved around a little bit more than I had really seen all season. So those are going to be things that we need to see from this group going into next season if they're going to really take that jump. And I do think we're going to start to see some of that this spring. You know, they're going to go against a pretty big offensive line in the spring. I want to see how they make those jumps in those areas. We're going to go into position battles next, but before we do, folks, do us a favor, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, share this podcast, give us a 5-star review at all of our podcast partners, including Spotify and every other area that you may be getting your podcast. We would greatly appreciate 5-star reviews. And if you have not done so, we appreciate you signing up for the message board at boards.irishbreakdown.com. We have a lot of stuff going on. We're going to have a lot on the message board tomorrow from post practice. I'm going to put my practice report out. I'm thinking about some different things of what I'm going to do for message board members only when it comes to our coverage of the practice. So you'll see tomorrow some of the stuff we're going to have. So definitely check that out again at boards.irishbreakdown.com.